Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is August the 27th, 2026. I'm continuing with my discussion on the Holocaust. I was a Holocaust study fellow at Columbia University's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies in 2020. And of course, I was very fortunate to have undertaken studies and Holocaust literature, read a lot about, the Holocaust. And I participated with many, it was predominantly Jewish students, even though they were, the course was open to, um, to everybody, everyone who was a student at Columbia University. But I was able to get some insight, from not just the distinguished, eminent professor, uh, Professor Jeremy Dober, who was the emeritus director of the institute at the time. Um, and is a professor of Yiddish, I think. And many of the students there, some became my friends, and they were descendants of survivors, and I learned something that I'd actually learned this before, but the word capo, it was my first time in learning that word capo. Of course, over the years, I've had Jewish friends, elderly Jewish friends who tell me about the Holocaust, who tell me about Jewish tradition, because of course I'm a Christian, and for many Jews, when they find out that you're Christian, right, and in case you didn't know, Christianity is actually was founded by Jewish people, right? Jesus was Jewish, and the God we serve in the Bible, right? Yahweh, He's God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are Jewish patriarchs, and of course, the Bible was a creation by Jewish people, right? It was Jewish people. Apostle Paul, um, who elaborated on the Christian doctrine, himself was Jewish, right? The disciples were Jewish, in case you didn't know. They weren't Europeans, right? But they did plant churches in Europe, right? And they proselytized amongst Europeans. And of course, Europeans adopted the Jewish religion. So it's interesting to learn directly from Jewish people, and I learned from them about insider threats, like traitors amongst their midst who participated in. They worked as collaborators for Nazis to implement the Holocaust, right? The systematic dehumanization and extermination of 6 million Jews, right? So. So capo, um, and you can think of them as what are called Judas goats. Now we have to be very careful. Just because I'm versed, I'm not an expert, but of course, because I like to study Jewish history, Jewish studies, I know that the term Judas, right? The term Judas is disconcerting amongst Jewish people because they view it as it's considered as a trope that was actually created to. It's an anti-Semitic trope that was created to criticize Jewish people that they were the ones who betrayed Jesus, and there's a long history, right, of anti-Semitism in Europe. Uh, I can't get into all of that right now, but what I want to talk about are the capos, right? The capos, and I was using an analogy of Judas goat. So the capos were they were traitors, right? They were Jewish people who were traitors, who were collaborators with the Nazis, and I'll get into that now. It's a the Holocaust was an unfortunate time in history, but history isn't something we should shy away from, or we should sweep under the rug, because we will always see, if we understand history, we can see red flags, right, manifesting in our society. The Nazi era, was horrible, and it dehumanized Jewish people, and it brought down humanity tremendously, right? Now, I'm noticing red flags of this Nazism, right? It starts with something little. In Christianity, we'll say leaven, right? Something, manifesting as something that seems like a trivial, it's a trivial transgression, something trivial, right? No big deal. But it soon expands, right? It magnifies, it amplifies, right? And then it becomes a Holocaust, right? And we're seeing these instances. I've talked about my travails in Montgomery County, Maryland. I have videos on that. But right now I'm going to focus on those insider threats, those traitors that are collaborators or are deemed as collaborators. And I'll just talk about the story of the Kapos, right? Kapos were, again, they were Jews who were collaborators with the Nazis. And I was using an analogy of the Judas goats. So, Judas goats, sometimes they're called Judas sheep. So they are trained goats, right? This literally in livestock, this is what happens. They're trained goats and they mingle with lambs, right? You've heard of the term a lamb to the slaughter. They mingle with lambs to lead the lambs. They're frightened, so the Judas goats are they're calm and they walk. They move ahead of the lambs and they're leading them to the holding pen where they're going to be slaughtered, right? But the lambs are unaware. They don't know any better. They're just following the Judas goats, right? Because the Judas goats is sort of like calming. It's like a calming force as it's moving calmly and leading them. And so the lambs are following the Judas goats. But there's already a mechanism, a device for the Judas goats to escape slaughter itself, right? It won't be slaughtered with the rest of the lambs. So there's an exit strategy. There's a side gate through which the Judas goats escapes, walks out, while the frightened, terrified lambs that had been following the Judas goats, with the Judas goats had led through the chute, leads them through the chute. The uh, the lambs don't know any better, and they enter the final holding pen where they are slaughtered. But the Judas goats has already escaped right up to the side. So basically, they're also sheep, right? It can be people like you. I've often described a proverb in my language. It says, "Ti ota ile o bakbani, ota eta o lirenikpa." And that's basically saying that the enemy in the household, that's your relatives, those who look like you, your enemies in the household, the traitors, though if they can't kill you, the enemy, the external enemy, right, cannot kill you. An enemy who's not part of your household, who's come from outside, can't kill you. So that it's the enemy that's within your household that looks like you, that's part of you. They're the dangerous ones that can sabotage you, undermine you, stab you in the back, sell you out to the enemy outside for the enemy outside to kill you. And so that's the idea of the Judas goods and the Kapos. Um, Now, I'm going to do another video explaining the history of the capos, how they were dealt with later on. So the capos, that's what they're called, capo. They were picked, selected by the Nazis, the SS, and to run the concentration camps. There were different stages. Sometimes the capos were in the ghetto, or where that's what it was called, because during the time of the Nazi era they would put Jewish people in a ghetto like in Poland. So the capo could be the Jewish police, right, who their job was to make sure that Jews who had been selected to go into the concentration camps where they would be exterminated did not concentrate. Sorry, did not escape. They did not escape. In fact, there was an example of one of them called Bernblatt, right? He became an operator, a conductor of the National Israeli Opera. And later on, a survivor recognized him and uh, he was actually prosecuted. So these capos, they were Jewish people, but they were used as sort of captains, right? I guess they said in the German language, capo actually means captain, right? It's short for a German word that means captain. Some people say it's actually capo, like boss in Italian. Their contentions of the origin of the word. But these were Jewish. officials, designated officials working under supervised by the Nazis to implement um, the Holocaust, to implement the dehumanization and abuse, and to supervise uh, Jewish people in the concentration camps. They did the work, they supervised them. They ended up being, brutalizing Jews themselves. There are benefits for them to serve as capos, right? Because they got better benefits. They got more food, and it is unfortunate because later on it's a very contentious, conflicting, issue matter amongst Jewish people, because later on, these capos were now viewed as victims themselves. Of course, they were victims, right? They were victims. They didn't create the Nazis, but the Nazis, just like what a lot of supremacist or dominant oppressor groups do, is they use divide and rule, right? They use divide and rule, and so they used Jewish people amongst the Jewish community, to be able to conquer and oppress Jews themselves. But those people that they used, their tools, um, were also victims. There's a reason why I'm focusing on this issue of capos, right, and the Holocaust, because remember, Jews were immigrants in Europe, and they were persecuted for almost 2,000 years in Europe, right, until the Holocaust, right, the extermination of 6 million Jews, right. And by the way, there were systematic laws that were used for their extermination and their persecution. This was legalized, right, through starting with the Nuremberg laws in 1935, September 1935. And prior to that, there were other laws that they used to strip Jews to isolate them economically. They stripped them of their rights, the ability to work in the civil service, to work in law, to work in medicine, right? So there's just a number of systematic things, mechanisms that they did to strip uh, Jews of citizenship and of any rights, right, in Nazi Germany. And we see this again. Jews were immigrants, although for a long time, right, over a millennium, but they continue to face persecution in Europe. And we're now seeing that we Africans, I'm a Nigerian, I'm an immigrant, and I've talked about how I was dehumanized. My certificate of naturalization is taken. They filed false charges, false accusations. A judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, Judge James Bonifant, like a Nazi judge, said he wanted me to lose my government job. They filed trumped up charges. They're using color of law, right? Like, these are making a pretense, right, that they're using the law to defame me, like I'm a terrible person, I'm a bad person, that they must hold like in a cage, that they must incarcerate, right? While what they're really doing is racism under color of law, right? It's neo-Nazi scheme pattern in Montgomery County, Maryland, right? And of course, their tools. The reason I'm talking about capos, their tools, right, are their capos, they're modern capos. Capo is a slur. They say the worst thing a Jew can call a Jewish person is a capo. It's a slur. But these things exist, right? And we have to label them as they are, because when life is at stake, right? I don't want Nigerians to be to now be the new Holocaust victims in America. It's starting to look like it. And the capos they're using against them are Black Americans. And they're using Nigerians like Jide Wariri, Howard University professor, Jide Wariri. But I will do another video and draw these parallels. But let me first describe the capos and the history of the capos. By the way, in case you're interested, there's a 1960 film called Capo on this. I think it's in German, or it's in another language though, but it's transcribed. I had the transcribed version, so you can see it. It's on the Holocaust, and by the way, also because capos capos were actually prosecuted amongst Nazi war criminals, right, later on by the Jewish Israel, the Jewish state, the Israel, the state of Israel. So in 1950, the Nazi and Nazi collaborators um, collaborators punishment law was enacted. And apparently, in fact, when that law to hunt and prosecute Nazis was first enacted, the original objective was to use it against Kapos, that's Jewish people who collaborated with uh, with 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 the Nazis, because the Nuremberg trials was already going on, right? So when the state of Israel enacted its Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law, its original objective was to pursue and prosecute to capture and prosecute Nazi collaborators who were Jewish, right? One of such people who was prosecuted, like I said, was a guy called Bernblatt, who was conductor of um, Israel's national Israel opera, or Israel's national opera or something. And he was identified and he was prosecuted and he was convicted. Later on, his conviction was commuted. But there were many people at the end of the Nazi era, when during the Second World War, when the Allied powers defeated the Nazis and the Nazi leaders had committed suicide in April 1945, the the internees in the Nazi concentration camps, the Jewish prisoners, amongst the first things they did was they actually lynched, they executed a mass lynching of the Kapos. So the Kapos were lynched. Later on, there were prosecutions, right? Some people were sentenced to death. There were prosecutions. Some people got life imprisonment. So these Kapos were actually prosecuted actively, right? But later on, uh, Jewish sentiment, survivors initially wanted the Kapos to be prosecuted, right? Because it was the survivors who were able to identify them. But over time, the survivors now and the state of Israel came to view these Kapos as victims themselves, right? It's just like uh, armed robbers, and because this is true, right? This is actually true. It's happened in Nigeria. Imagine armed robbers coming to a home and they're holding a gun and they're sordid, they're brutal, they're evil, and they invade a home and they ask a um, a house help, just because these armed robbers are demonic, they're diabolical, right? They're depraved. They ask a they ask a house help living in the household to tie up a victim of their armed robbery, like a daughter, tie her up and rape her, right? Now, later on, are you going to prosecute the house help who's has a gun to his head and he's being told he's doing it under duress, right? To tie up the the daughter of of the household that's being held captive by the armed robbers so she could be raped. Are you going to now charge the house help as an accomplice, who has a gun to his head? So that's sort of how the Jewish state now, the Israeli state now sees the Kapos, right? They did these things under duress. Now I'm going to do another video and talk about sort of the Kapos amongst Nigerians as well, right? I always talk. I've done videos and I've discussed in writing before that the transatlantic slave trade, of which West Africa was its main source, was its primary source, would not have gone on for so long and on such a large scale without West African collaborators, right? There were West Africans who collaborated, and that's why the transatlantic slave trade went on. Even during slavery in America, the reason why slave rebellions failed, like the Gabriel's Rebellion. I've done a video talking about Gabriel's Rebellion, right, in Virginia, under the era of President James Monroe, right? He was governor of Virginia at the time, and he put down the rebellion. The reason these rebellions failed in America was because there were black slaves, black enslaved persons who would stab the plotters in the back, and they would, they squill on them. They'd squill on them. They'd go and tell them, the slave masters, right, that, well, these slaves are planning, they're plotting a rebellion. They're plotting to escape, and so those are examples of kapos, right? So again, they're like traitors within your midst. One of the first things that Black Americans who became my friends and some who became my mentors, they warned me not against white people, but against Black people. And they'd say, look, not all skin folk is kinfolk. That's the first time I heard this from Black Americans. It's something they say. If you get close to them, they'll teach you certain things. They'll tell you not all skin folk is kinfolk, right? They'll tell you about crabs in the barrel, that blacks have been programmed in America to undermine other blacks like them, to pull them down. Any black wants to ascend, wants to get out of their mud seal. That's their underclass status. They've been programmed and conditioned to undermine you and to sabotage you. And it's because the reason I'm talking about these things now is because I've experienced it. I experienced it in the Department of the Navy. I was working with black women. All of them sabotaged me. They made fabrications. My mentor was a black woman, Auditor General of the Navy. Now she's been disgraced out of the Navy because of her, her double dealing, right? Her backstabbing ways, right? And so you can read the report of investigation, DOD investigation, on the Auditor General of the Navy, Donjet L. Gilmore, right? So you see, these are unfortunate things that you learn. I've learned them, and I'm sharing these videos amongst new Nigerian Americans so you can avoid those pitfalls, those traps, right? Those snares that are just part of America, right? When I say point out racism in America, that's not the only thing I talk about, right? Because when I've been successful in America, I didn't come with my parents. I've achieved what I wanted to do. I have a law degree from George Washington University Law School. I graduated from an Ivy League, Columbia University, and I worked as a stockbroker. I worked in the Department of Defense. I hold a top secret TSSCI clearance, right? It's the highest level of national security an American can have, right? So I've done a number of things. I've been successful, but there's half of Americans. America's always been a divided country from the inception. Half of Americans support Africans, will support you as a new migrant here, support me, right? Support Africans. There's another half that doesn't. And that half that doesn't is ready to kill you, is ready to destroy America to do it. They're ready to do all sorts of things, right? This country went through a civil war, half and half, right? Even at the inception, half of Americans were patriots, wanted independence from Great Britain. There was another half that didn't. They're called loyalists to the British Crown. It divided houses, right? It divided the house of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's son was a royal governor of New Jersey. He was incarcerated. He lived the rest of his life in Great Britain because he was a loyalist. The same thing in the Civil War, right? Abraham Lincoln's wife's family was on the side of the Confederates. They were killed. Ulysses Grant's wife's family as well. Her brothers were on the side of the Confederate. The same with Abraham Lincoln's wife's family. So America is divided half and half. That's just the history. And so you, for your own protection, understand the history. And that's why I was talking about another monumental period of world history, the Holocaust, right? So we don't hear about the Jewish traitors who betrayed, the Jewish population in the implementation of the Holocaust when they served as tools, right, in execution of the Holocaust. We don't talk about them because Jewish people themselves and the state of Israel, they sealed their prosecution. These people were prosecuted. They were mass. Lots of people were prosecuted. There were two people who were prosecuted for the murders of 189 uh, of Jewish people during the Holocaust, right? And so there are a number of trials that went on of these capos, But the Jewish state, the state of Israel, sealed these documents, so we don't know a lot about them. They sealed them for 75 years, so we won't get to see the details, right? And the same thing, Black Americans or Nigerians as well, new Nigerian immigrants, we don't want to talk about those insider threats that are dangerous to us, to our safety, our protection, our security in America, right? I'm talking about Jide Wariri. He's one of those capos, one of those dangerous people. He's a professor at Howard University. He almost got me killed. He was trying to lead me like a Judas goat, right? Lead a lamb to the slaughter. But God saved me. I'll do more videos. This is 25 minutes. I'll do more videos explaining the Holocaust. It's very important. And when I draw parallels with the Holocaust, I'm not minimizing the Holocaust, right? You can't talk about the Holocaust enough because it was a fact in history. It happened. And I'm drawing parallels, I wouldn't minimize the Holocaust. I wouldn't, because it's ironic that I'm sure when these red flags were showing up, were manifesting in Nazi Germany, um, there would have been Jews who would have ignored these red flags, right? They were ignoring them. And so you don't want to be a Nigerian migrant, a new Nigerian American, a new African American who is ignoring these red flags, right? In which your rights are being systematically divested. You're being stripped systematically of your humanity. During the Holocaust, right? So the Nazis, again, they created laws, biological racial laws, right? Calling Jewish people subhuman, right? They call them biological parasites. Does that ring a bell in America? A black's called subhuman. Even today, forget slavery, that's a long time ago. But even today, you can see what's going on in our schools, right? DEI, the claims that blacks cannot get a job, are not qualified for anything, that they're just DEI hires, right? You can see what's going on today. I was stripped of my identity. They created a man not related to me and said he's my uncle and had him fabricate things against me. Went through the court process, right? So identify the red flags and protect yourself. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll do more videos explaining the Holocaust. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.